Spare, the ninja. Harry explains that from Shawbury he moved on to Middle Wallop, great name, and now he knew how to fly a helicopter. But now he needed to understand how to fly it tactically. So that meant flying whilst doing other things as well. And that meant that his brain had to be rewired, and his Yoda in doing this would be Nigel, aka Nige. He then explained that it was his fourth flight instructor and arguably the most important. He was training with a squirrel. And the fact is that Nige explained that he needed iron discipline. And it was not just the flying of the helicopter, but the discipline inside his head that needed to be disciplined. And he explained that it required time and patience, but also a kind of self-love, which seems rather extraordinary thing to discuss when it comes to flying a helicopter. But nevertheless, he explained that the flight instructor told him to believe in himself, although he often did not. He explained that often it was like his mind was seizing up like an overheated engine, and the red mist would come down, and I'd stop thinking, stop functioning. He explains that sometimes his self-loathing would spill onto Nige. He'd have a go at him, saying, "You fly it," again showing the strong narcissistic trait of anger bubbling up. But always, he explained, "No, you can fly it, you do it." And Harry says that basically the individual was that he needed a ninja, and that was what he got. That over several months, Nige the ninja showed him how to fly a helicopter whilst doing other things. And he had explained that the ninja would sugarcoat nothing. He was blunt and got to the point about everything. He explains as well in quite candid fashion about how he got defensive and how he would shoot him hate you forever stares and he would stop listening, but Nige the ninja would press on and on and on. And he explains that he realises now that he was one of the most truthful people that he'd ever known. And he knew a secret about truth that many people are unwilling to accept. It's usually painful. And he explained that he saw that Harry wasn't terribly concerned about dying. And Harry said that he hadn't been afraid of dying since the age of 12, which of course we all know what that coincides with. He then explains that Nigel eventually let him free and gave him his certification and announced that he was ready to fly Apaches, except he wasn't going to yet fly them, he was going to read about them. And then he thought, well, that's rather cruel. Promise me a helicopter and then give me a load of homework. There was a 3-month course, and he said that he wanted to get back into flying. And he said that actually he considered leaving the course because he didn't want to fly Apaches. He wanted to fly a Lynx, which was simpler, and he'd get back to the war faster. But that was quashed by his commanding officer, who said that he was a very good pilot and he was going to fly Apaches, and that he reads the ground very well, and so this was what he was meant to do. And therefore he was into the classroom, and then eventually he was allowed to get into the Apache. And it's interesting that he shows the amount of time all of this training and involvement takes, and of course the lack of patience that he generally has, albeit he sticks at it. And eventually he found himself in the Apache on his own. And then he explains how the Apache felt less and less alien to him. And he talks more about the nature of the helicopters, and he then explains that they start with an exercise called the bag, where the Apache's windows were covered and you felt as if you were inside a brown paper bag. You had to take all the data about conditions outside the aircraft through instruments and gauges. He explained it was eerie, unnerving, but effective, kind of forced a development of a second sight. He then explains going up in the night sky and flying over Salisbury Plain and London, seeing the Thames, and going over the palaces and wondering if Granny was there. And he talks about different types of technology that's involved, and he explains that at one point he was blinded when he was up there at night, and immediately, of course, it caused him to cause a memory to come to mind of Muhammad Al-Fayed giving him and William laser pens from Harry's, and that they used them like lightsabers the time they were given to them. He then moves on by saying that at the tail end of his Apache training at Wattisham Airfield in Suffolk, he got yet another instructor. And then he explains that he thought he recognised him, and it turns out that this individual was part of the team that had extracted him back in 2008. And there you are. So he gives us the details about this individual who's the ninja, who'd pushed him through his training and made him understand about the truth of himself. And the reading of the training is reasonably interesting about what he went through and telling you about the technical aspects, and it's something that he's certainly taken an interest in. Undoubtedly, of course, I think the ghostwriter will have gone back and looked at some of the detail about these aircraft for the purposes of including this to flesh it all out. But it shows that what they're trying to do in this book is create this image of Harry where there are always these repeated reminders of the trauma that he's experienced. And rather than just saying, yeah, I went and did my training and I really enjoyed it and there was this and this, there always has to be these little reminders, as if there is this idea of, well, there's a particular narrative that we want to put with this particular autobiography, and we need to keep ramming it home for the reader, which I must admit, after a while, starts to become rather tedious. As I mentioned in Parts Passim, he should have just done a book about his mother and then done a separate book, basically about his life apart from his mother. So he could tell you about where he got to and the relationships that he's had. What's interesting is, of course, William gets mentioned here and there, ultimately not that favourably, but he's not exactly hammering him. And ditto with his father. There's not a lot about his grandfather, which is interesting, and there's not a lot about the Queen. Maybe he's saving that for another book. That's probably likely to be the place. So what we're getting here is a sort of run-through of his life so far. But it's interesting that such key people, and probably more interesting individuals, have not really been mentioned that much. Clearly, they're being saved for future publication. And it's also interesting, of course, that certain people just get the barest of mentions, and you do feel, in a weird kind of way, that it's all sort of quite superficial, really. You get a short chapter, and it's a bit of a mention about this and a bit of a mention about that, and you almost, sometimes in a way, it almost feels like flying over all of his life in a helicopter rather fast, only getting certain glimpses of it all. Anyway, up next, it's Botswana again. Join me there.